Welcome back, everyone. To celebrate the holidays, I'm breaking down 3 decks from the Doctor Who Commander set. Today, we're discussing not 1, but 3 decks, and first up is the 11th Doctor with Amy Pond. Together, this pair is one of the more complex pairings and far from the strongest, so there aren't very many decks being built for them. But I'm a big Doctor Who fan, and this pairing was the first Doctor Who's episodes I saw as they aired, so I'd like to make the effort. Let's start with the Suspend ability. Suspend lets you cast a spell without paying its mana cost, and typically that means you get the most value when you skip the greatest mana cost. But that's not actually what's happening here. Since the 11th Doctor applies time counters equal to its mana value, you're still paying for the spell, just with turns instead of mana. Outside of Suspend, buying a turn will usually cost about 5 mana, but this ability turns 1 turn into 1 mana, which is a terrible deal. But when you have multiple cards on Suspend, the whole story changes. Each turn effectively pays for that much mana, meaning that your deck is much more efficient when you've suspended more cards, making double strike enablers very good here. Now we need to know what cards we're suspending. If mana values are too large, we're probably not able to cast them at all. While Amy does give us a way to remove time counters to speed things up, I think it would be best to use 6 mana as an upper bound, since that's the biggest we would probably cast in a 10-turn game without access to Amy. When it comes to what we want those spells to do, there are 3 kinds of effects that I love for this. The first are board wipes. Putting a board wipe on Suspend makes the game much more interesting for your opponents by asking them if they're going to continue committing resources to the battlefield, knowing that they will be swept away. This is a really funny decision point that can keep potential blockers out of the way of our commanders if nothing else. The second kind of card I want to suspend are impractical combos. What I mean by this is those combinations that are either too awkward in mana cost or in timing to work under normal circumstances. For example, Take a Stand plus Wrath of God usually makes for a 7 mana one-sided board wipe at sorcery speed. But if you suspend either of these cards, you can essentially skip the mana cost on one piece of that combination, and get a one-sided wipe for only 3 or 4 mana. There's mixed news about this though. These kinds of impractical combos don't usually show up in combo databases like Commander Spellbook, which means it's harder to come up with cards that could meet this criteria. But it also means there can be a lot of diversity in these deck lists, so I don't think that's a total loss. The third kind of card I'm interested in working with are copy spells. These cards can work either by suspending a heavier spell and casting this in response to the last time counter trigger, or by suspending the copy spell and hard casting the heavier spell. Once again, there's a lot of diversity here with what you could copy, but at least these spells should be showing up more on EDH Ref. Whether we suspend it or not, one thing is clear: we need access to a lot of card draw. Normally, you might like to change gears to card draw around the time you start to cast 2 spells a turn, but the 11th Doctor suspending a card from your hand each turn, you're effectively double spelling off his first attack, and that cuts through the cards in your hand like a lightsaber through butter, not to mention when you actually start double spelling. Today, instead of going in depth on cards to avoid and a timeline of cards to include, I just want to highlight some of what I think should be the core components of these decks, since there aren't very many of these decks running around in the first place. First, I want to highlight these double strike enablers. The 2 backgrounds apply to both commanders, making it easier for them to get through without paying for the Doctor's ability, and granting both of them double strike, while Twinferno can be either a hit enabler or a copy spell. Next, I want to highlight these sweepers. Since we're heavily involving our commanders, we don't want them getting swept up in the destruction, and having these board wipes suspended can clear out blockers while keeping our board intact and keeping opponents on their toes. To refill our hand, I really like these cards. The Chronicler lets us draw 5 for free over the course of the game and gives us a big beater on top of that, while wheel effects like the Magus are almost always better for us than our opponents, though maybe a Smothering Tithe wouldn't be amiss here. Next up are the 10th Doctor and Clara Oswald. Ten lets you attack with any creature to get the suspend rather than needing to deal combat damage. The spells always have 3 time counters instead of its mana value, so each turn can pay for multiple mana if you stack your deck that way. And even more so now, the same rules that applied to 11's suspend ability apply here. Having multiple cards ticking away on suspend at the same time makes that exchange even more efficient. And when you look at that efficiency in the context of the timey-wimey ability, every piece of this commander wants you to suspend as many cards as you can. So the companion we choose should enable that in some way. At a whopping 6 mana with no form of protection whatsoever, Clara also copies the Doctor's triggered ability and lets us suspend more cards. The downside, of course, being that our commanders are now 5 and 6 mana apiece, but we get to choose the 3rd color for our color identity, and green is an easy choice here. It gives us access to mana dorks to cast our commanders, as well as creatures that can attack for immediate value, as well as other sources of mana to recast our commanders if they get shot down, or even hardcast our big mana spells when they end up in our hand instead of on suspend. Lastly, extra combat and extra turn spells are amazing here. The extra combat spells get us extra suspend triggers, and the extra turn spells not only get us those extra combats, but also take off more time counters with an extra upkeep, and untap lands to pour into our timey-wimey ability, should we choose. Unlike a lot of extra combat enablers, Bloodthirster, World at War, and Portraiser can generate multiple extra combats, and since Suspend gives creatures haste, we make them even deadlier if we hit them off our attack trigger. Another way you can get more Suspend triggers is with clone effects, and actually that's the version of the deck I built. And if you're interested, you always want your clone math to work out like this when deciding which creature to copy. But you don't have to play it as clones. Lastly, it has to be said that extra turn spells are crazy here, and giving you an extra attack step is really, really strong. So I think we want these as our finishers. Next up, I'm looking at the 12th Doctor paired with Romana II. Romana can make copies of a token that hit the field this turn. This is at its best when copying the very best tokens, so we're probably not copying treasures, soldiers, or food tokens. Notably, Romana only copies the token, so if a token is created and a delayed triggered ability would take that token away, Romana lets us keep an extra copy around that won't disappear. So keep an eye out for those effects. This is especially powerful when noticing that copies of permanent spells become tokens. So Romana can give us an extra copy of something we've demonstrated with the 12th Doctor, who is a wall of text unto himself. Since we first need ways to cast spells from outside our hand, and then to cast them, this is a very mana-intensive strategy. So I especially like Cascade and Discover to help cut corners on mana costs. Next, the opponent has no choice but to accept our demonstration. So if we can find things that are good for us but bad for them even when they control it, those are all-stars here. But in general, it's usually a lot easier to find effects that are good for us while useless to an opponent. For example, giving Apprentice Wizard to an opponent who can't make blue helps us on mana and gives them an 0/1 that they can't use. The next thing I notice about the 12th Doctor is that he has some of the same text that a certain Thunderbutt dinosaur has on its text box, meaning that the Doctor goes infinite with copy spells cast from outside your hand. So we'll keep an eye out for those effects. Apprentice Wizard, Jessica's Will, and Vessel of Volatility are all excellent mana packages that we can give to opponents who can't make or use the mana and won't be able to play those cards this turn. Volcanic Torrent, Grasp of Fate, and Noise Marine are great but complex, so I'll explain what happens if they're demonstrated. For Torrent and Marine, Demonstrate and Cascade are both cast triggers. So have the Cascade on each resolve before the Demonstrate. Then give a copy to an opponent who hasn't cast or can't cast anything this turn. The opponent copies do nothing, while your copies all see the spells you've cast and get to work crippling enemy board states. And when you don't demonstrate them, they get you a Demonstrate. Grasp of Fate is really good without a demonstration, but gets crazy with a demonstration. You can give it to an opponent who will negotiate what they target of yours. If they don't negotiate or you don't like their decision, since their copy enters first, just have your demonstrated copy exile theirs and let your original resolve. If you even manage to make a copy token with Romana, you can make this a powerful board wipe. If you're going off budget, Edgin, Passionate Archaeologist, and Bonehorde Dracusaur are all incredible here. If you demonstrate a Passionate Archaeologist to an opponent who isn't casting from exile and copy it with Romana, you can get 6 triggers from any spell you hit from exile and start knocking out opponents. The Dracusaur, of course, exiles cards and makes tokens, some of which are mana and should be an excellent engine for our deck. Since these aren't full deck techs, I can't say very much about power levels, but I would rank them something like this. What I can say something about is how complex these commanders are and how much unexplored territory there is with them. So if complexity is what's been holding you back from building these decks, I hope this helped. And if you liked this new format where I examine the cores of multiple decks at once without going in too deep on full deck lists, let me know in the comments below. Maybe I'll do these more regularly in addition to full deck decks. Thanks for watching.